Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing well. My name is Unvi and I'm your host for the podcast Through Their Eyes. Today I just wanted to talk about something that's a little different from what I usually talk about. And overall, the main theme of today's episode is if the world comes with a price tag, how do we maintain a soul? So I'm sure a lot of you out there are interested in the World Cup. Not everyone, but a lot of you are, and I also am really interested in the World Cup. But there's been a lot of discussion as to the World Cup and how it's been unfair to certain people. Let's talk about the sport itself. Soccer or football, as it's called globally, is something that is just a really popular thing, of course, but it's something that represents human passion. Having a variety of different countries from all over the world come together to compete in something that's super meaningful to them. Even if it's just two guys kicking a sport or a ball around. Even though there's like so many more. That's how Americans apparently view soccer for some reason. But regardless of that, regardless of it all, that's the main part of soccer. It's just human passion. And for that reason, that's why it brings so many people from, around the world to go and watch their sport, or start their sporting team, play this sport. And that's why they're so excited when they win and so devastated when they lose, because it's an extension of their culture. And there's a great book that discusses this, and I think it's called, it's called, I'll have to remember and talk about it next episode because I don't remember off the top of my head. But that's a great book, and it discusses why symbols like flags really matter and how that connects to a country's overall culture. So when I remember that book name, I will definitely tell all of you. But with soccer, soccer is like an extension of that symbol. Soccer is basically like, oh, this is my team, this is like the culture they represent. Going out there and competing, it has so much more empathy and so much more, compassion for the human spirit than much else does. And it's been around for so long, right? So it's just something that really shows the human meaning. However, with the World Cup, especially it being in America, which is kind of funny, it's heavily monetized. I'm gonna say that it's different. Obviously, there's more teams competing. There's no more rules and whatnot, but it is a heavily monetized sport for FIFA specifically, and in general as well. When you really think about it, honestly, right, many people have been talking about the song that Jelly Roll put out, and if you guys are online, you'll hear it, and it sounds really sterile when compared to all of the other, music that's out there for the World Cup, especially if you take like Shakira, and she's like an icon when it comes to World Cup music, right? So when you take someone like Jelly Roll and you add a very American or a very, neutral view on the whole song making process, it really takes that heart and that spirit and that passion out of music and really makes it, something that's just like blah. And to talk on that further, a lot of people who were really fed up with all of this music, being so sterile, have actually turned to AI to make better songs. And these songs consist of mainly the players' names being said in succession. So it's like Mbappe, and then it continues down like the roster of the French national team, for example. And they're all the same. Even in their quest to make a different, more passionate World Cup song, all of the songs that are, meant to make the songs better, meant to make the game sound better, all sound the same. So in our quest to try and make, our humanity come back, especially with a sport such as, like, football or soccer that has so much of this historically, we're losing our ability to humanize things, which is funny because it's like this is supposed to be made by a human, but now it's so sterile. And I think moving on from that, a lot of these billionaires and corporations, and while billionaires and corporations are important for certain things, it's still, a controversy. And, I have my own opinions on that, but we won't get into that. Billionaires and corporations, they during the World Cup are really capitalizing on this cultural joy. But in their way of capitalizing on this cultural joy, they're sucking all of that culture out of it, which is honestly just such a devastation for so many people, and to the point where they have to go and make their own music, which again is perpetuating that cycle of just dehumanizing all of this media, which is really sad. in hindsight, to think about, but even now as we're continuing to live through it. And especially because a lot of the people for this World Cup, not only have to listen to really bleak music and listen to billionaires basically capitalize on their cultures, they also are unable to afford a ticket. I was talking to a few people and they were like, oh yeah, the tickets are this much, the tickets are that much. The tickets have gone so high that the everyday average person, which the World Cup is meant for, which World Cup was based off of, are unable to support the World Cup, which is hilarious thinking about it. There's actually a book I was reading, and I haven't finished it yet, but it is called World Cup Fever by Simon Cooper. And it discusses how he went to all of the World Cups, from 1990 and onward. And he was basically talking about his experiences with each one and how it was like an interesting and moving like moment for him. And the World Cup itself is a very interesting and also very memorable event. It happens every 4 years, but it's still like cool every time it happens. And more than that, it's like it's impactful. It's something we talk about, for a super long time. So, to take that away from people, not only to take away their music, not only to take away their culture, but to take away their ability to even watch the beautiful game is kind of dystopian, really. And it really just begs the question, if global entities can, commodify our lives, on the global scale, then what about, our daily lives? What's stopping us from, having that commodification, when it comes to what we're doing on the daily, how we're having activities, how we're doing all these things. So I think the World Cup really is just like this over, this large example of what, it means to lose, a soul when the world has a price tag on it, especially for something that starts as, something that people play in their backyards. There is a very moving picture actually, and it's a picture of this like child, and he's basically, more in an impoverished neighborhood, and he's, right outside of the stadium, and he's basically just amongst all of this dirt and all of this rabble, and he's just, looking like just desolately at like the gleaming World Cup stadium and all of the lights and all of the shining like loud sounds and everything. And it shows how it started. It started with the youth. It started with, people who just wanted to live and wanted to find meaning in their life through like just playing and having fun, and how that got so monetized because now, if you guys follow anything with soccer, about the whole Mbappe thing, about everyone, getting mad at all of these football players for not playing right football. And it really just begs the question of, how did they get paid so much money to do something that, is so deeply rooted in the human spirit? It's kind of funny how we pay all of these athletes so much money to just do something that we all, do. We all want to play sports. We all go outside, we play our sports, whether it's baseball, whether it's soccer, whether it's like, American football. Whatever it is, we're just doing it for fun. So to see all these athletes basically just get overly monetized for just doing the same things we do, but at a grander scale because they can just kick a ball better. Of course, it's more than that, but just for oversimplification purposes, I'll call it that. It's just very dystopian, and it's very sad to see that huge gap between the roots of something so human and where it's become now. So in that regard, I definitely wanted to connect that overarching example to something more relatable to us as humans. I think especially when it comes to school, myself being a high school student, I think that with this whole, oh, this is how everything is done, everything's overly monetized, et cetera, it definitely impacts how we're, taught things. From personal experience growing up in the United States, but I know this isn't just something that's in the United States, this is something, overall in many different countries around the world. School is not really there for you to learn anything. I was actually talking to my cousin, and he's a little bit younger than I am, but he was discussing how in India, he is basically given all of these textbooks and he's given all of these like teachings and whatever, and he has to make sense of them himself. And a lot of the times, students aren't really learning to understand the concepts, to understand the material. Rather, they're learning for, passing tests and quizzes and making sure they score high on exams, all to secure a life, which sounds so dystopian when you think about it for more than 3 seconds. All of these kids are just wasting their short period on this planet, this finite mortal life, on just learning information for what? To achieve like the game, which is such a dystopian thing, and I'm definitely not the first person to bring this up, but I think we as a society love to forget that fact and just say, oh, that's just how it is, we need capitalism to make the world go round. And I think that is true to a certain degree. We do need these systems in place to have a society that functions and ensures that we have a good life. But it's the extent to which that society takes away our own lives. It's supposed to be there as a boundary, as a gate. But if we are using that society to really dictate how we live our own lives, it can be seen as very toxic, and it can be seen as something that's overarching and takes away our ability to really live. And I think definitely in schools, especially in America, schools aren't really there to teach you a concept. There was a thing done, I think it was a study of some sort, I don't remember. But even then, the overarching idea from that study remains true. It's just like when you tested students on their knowledge of previous subjects, a lot of them couldn't really recollect what those previous subjects really taught them because they were so worried about cramming information in there for a test, for a quiz, for a final exam. They weren't actually worried about whether they could understand the material or not, which posed the big question of how are we going to, number one, teach our students to become functioning adults, but number two, how are we going to teach our students, because schools aren't teaching students how to learn. They're teaching students how to be compliant, how to be good workers, how to go into the world and make money, which is such a waste of life. I think so many religions in this world teach us, there's so much beauty in life, but a lot of them really focus on that societal aspect rather than that natural aspect. So I think the natural progression from just focusing so much on society towards, like where we are now, it's so crazy because it's like those ideals about society and the way that they, made everyone live and how corrupted they've become now. So I definitely think schools are less about learning and more about you just like trying to get people acclimated to that rat race, to that competition, which is so prevalent in not only capitalism, but the world itself. It's a dog eat dog world, and humans, we are biologically programmed to be competitive. So by, leaning into that, especially in schools, because schools are the society that, us young people are in before we go into the real world, it really does teach us, how to be competitive, how to really win in the capitalist game, which relies on that competitiveness, which I think is another reason why capitalism is such a popular and such a needed ideal, because it focuses heavily on the human need for competitiveness, that human biological traits, like, so etched in competitiveness. So I definitely think that is the issue with schools. And the worst thing is if we didn't have grades, if we didn't have all of these markers, which really taught us, oh, this person is less than that person, we wouldn't have cheating. We wouldn't have people like skipping school or having like issues with all of those like mental illnesses that come around, like being so stressed and anxious about, a variety of things. If we did not saying that grades are going to magically fix every mental illness, but it's like a lot of mental illnesses wouldn't be so exasperated if it weren't for things like grades in people's lives that just like always like constantly marked them up to like on like this standing and this leaderboard and said you're not good enough because of this like random thing, but this person was able to accomplish that random thing. So now they're higher up on that ladder than you are. And I think grades are just such a great example of that ladder because it's like, oh, what if I had an extenuating circumstance? What if I just didn't understand this material better, but I understood another material better? Grades just teach you, oh, this person is better scoring at this subject than you are. So in that regard, you're poorer. You are not good at this subject. And I think they also indirectly teach us that it doesn't really matter if you're talented at the arts or you're talented at the humanities. It doesn't matter about that. Because even though people say, oh, it's okay, you're still talented at this, you're still talented at that, you still have worth, grades indirectly, imply that no, you really aren't because you haven't gotten top rank, you haven't gotten this, you haven't gotten that. So they, despite what society is trying to do to, ensure that we all feel a little bit better as people, it instead is trying to be like, you know what? No, you aren't that good. And even though people are telling you you are talented in other ways, you really aren't. Because in the grand scheme of things to apply to colleges, to, basically continue on for the rest of your life. Even if you're talented in other things, you indirectly are not valued by society in the same way those who are talented at the stereotypical things are. So it's just this constant cycle of just people who are talented at other things and really do deserve to go into wonderful things and live their own life, basically being indirectly shunned, even though everyone pretends to be supportive of them. They're indirectly shunning them by saying, oh, but you didn't go and succeed in that, like, expected path. And those who do, like, succeed in those expected paths, you can see this little shift in people's perspectives of them. So it very much is just this toxic cycle that continues and continues. And, it's just a bunch of value made up on, like, made up things. It's all made up. Like, who decides if you get an A or a B? Who decides if this is bad or good? So many schools across the nation always are like, oh, it's a 92 or higher, that's an A. Oh, it's a 90 or higher, that's an A. It's an 85 or higher. It's always changing and it's always made up. And yet this one grade impacts how people perceive themselves for the rest of their lives. Everyone says, oh, high school grades don't matter, da 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 da. They do matter. People still talk about them. People are like, oh, this person got a 4.0 GPA in high school. It's something to brag about. Because even though people will say at some point it stops mattering, because it does stop mattering at some point, for a good chunk of your life, no, it doesn't. Because even if you don't talk about it often, if that grade meant something to you, it's going to mean something to you for a long time. If people said you were bad at math in high school, you're going to think you were bad at math for the rest of your life because those things stick with you. You are a human, you are not a robot. And in that regard, the emotional impacts of not being good at something that you are passionate about or even just like want to be good at, by being told off the get-go you will never be good at that thing indirectly by your grades or by your peers, that sticks with you for life. That is not something that you can just say, oh, it doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't matter about the grade, it matters about the principle of it. If I was passionate about math but I was always told my entire life you are not good at math, then I would never be interested in experiencing the beauties of math and expanding my life. I would be shackled to the confines of thinking I was only good at humanities, and that is what happened to me as an example. And now, only now am I realizing I want to be good at math. I want to have fun with math. Even if I get like an 86 in AP pre-calculus or whatever, it doesn't matter because I deserve to be good at math. I deserve to put the effort in and get entitled to the result of me just like working. Maybe I'm not entitled to the result of being good at math, but I'm entitled to, at the very least, having the ability to explore math more and try to get good at it. Because while you're only entitled to the work, there's so much that could happen, so much you could grow from by even just putting a foot forward. And I think that all of these like made up things really hinder us from making real life progress, tangible, material progress that isn't made up. And I definitely think that there is like a specific quote, and it's by Albert Camus in his book The Stranger, and it really just takes all of that and ties up into a nice little ribbon. It basically says, I said that people never change their lives, and that in any case one life was as good as another, and that I wasn't dissatisfied with mine here at all. It basically just talks about how the world doesn't care about your achievements, and you as one person are not that great in the grand scheme of things. In that regard, it's like you should focus so much more on, living a quality life rather than like living a life so focused on, the grades and on the made up things. Because at the end of the day, have you wasted your life trying to chase all of these made up achievements? Have you wasted the beautiful, finite, mortal life that you have trying to achieve something in order to gain societal approval? And famously, the character Marcel in that book basically rejects all of that societal approval and basically tries to go against it because he doesn't find any meaning. There's no inherent meaning or value in what society is saying, and maybe that isn't like completely true for the everyday person. There is some meaning in society, we can't deny that, but at the same time, society cannot be the thing that you live for. You have to live for yourself. Because at the end of the day, if you have no one, who are you living for? Yourself. And I think in that regard, it's also the same with work. Trading 40 plus hours of your life, every single week just to afford the right of existence. That sounds so dystopian, but it's something that we've normalized as people because we want that capitalist society to continue. And again, capitalist economy, it's needed, but at the same time, we can't let it control our life. We can't let, that 40 plus hours of our life, be the entirety of it, just to make money, just to do this, just to do that. Those are important things. Those are needs that we need. And I will go into the issue of money in a little bit, but it's just so interesting to see how people are like moths to a light, and this is a quote that was given to me by a friend. She found it and she told me, and it stuck with me to this day. And she basically stated that God thinks of us how we think of a moth to a street lamp. The moth thinks that the street lamp is the sun, how we think that these like tangible mortal achievements are our whole life, are our whole world. And that's not true. And I think in that regard, by realizing how fake everything is, and by understanding that we have the control of our own life no matter what it may be. Maybe I'm working a 9 to 5, maybe I have kids, it doesn't really matter what your reality looks like, because at the end of the day, if people can make up an entire society, make up money, then you can find and quote unquote make up your own existence, because you can. Your external situation doesn't have to dictate your internal response to it. It's like an intrinsic state of control or something of that nature, where it basically says that you internally control your life, and the extrinsic, more like external thing that doesn't have to, control your life. If you have a bad day, you can control how you react to it. You can control how it means and what it means to you, rather than letting it, ruin your day. And I think that's just something that's so important to realize, especially when we struggle with something like the society that we live in, and having a mortal, finite life as well. And I think on the regards to money, like I said, money is such a collective thing, if I want to say. And what I mean by that is it's something that we've collectively just agreed upon as a society. What is money? Money is like, paper. It's just paper that dictates so much. And in more recent times, it's like pixels on your screen. You don't really think about it as often. You're just like taking like a little card, and then you're just putting into the card reader and saying, okay, this is my shopping at Target, or here's a dollar bill, let me have some like a stick of gum or whatever back in the days. You can tell how old I am from my descriptions of the dollar. Regardless of that, money just seems so interesting in the sense of this is one paper. This is like one like pixel on my screen, or more multiple pixels on my screen, that dictates like not only how people are treated, but it dictates how many people sleep outside, ownership, like your actual life. If I do one wrong thing and I lose all my money, the amount of potential that my life has, the amount of potential that anyone's life has, not just mine, but anyone's, is immediately compromised, because in this society we put so much value on money, so much value on this quote unquote made up stuff to basically take our entire future and dictate it. The grades thing, right? Grades, even though we don't like to admit it, impact where we go to college. And college is a big step in how we, choose our jobs later on. How we, like, how much we struggle to get those jobs. And of course, it's a struggle for everyone nowadays to get jobs, but especially if you've never gone to college, you're not gonna get a job as easily as like Jimmy, who has like a master's degree in computer science, right? So in that regard, just having all of these made up things dictate our life is just such a dystopian concept that we really don't think about as often. And of course, a lot of people say that's just how life is. It's a give and take. We're going back on those like human like or ideals of just like dog eat dog world competitiveness. But at the same time, we aren't animals. We are humans. And that is such an important distinction. We are not animals that thrive off of that competitiveness. We are given, maybe by if the god, if you believe so, or by the universe, or whoever, evolution maybe, the ability to think, the ability to become enlightened. And we waste that by pretending to be animals, by pretending to have a ideal that's just like, oh, that's just how life is, and that's just like this radical acceptance of our own imprisonment in this shackle of society, right? Then we've already lost it. We're no better than an animal that accepts, like, oh, this is what I have to do to get food. This is what I have to do to get shelter. There is no drivenness in a person to actually achieve anything. It's just given to us and we accept it. And that is not how we should be. We are enlightened creatures, so why don't we act like it? And I think that's a big struggle that, has been going on for so many, like, centuries. That's not anything new, but it's something that we really have to think about. All of these people who say they're enlightened, all of these people who say, oh, I feel freed now, I feel like I found my moksha. And moksha is basically a Hindu ideal for, finding forever peace. In the most oversimplified way. People who say that, they've let go of how the external world impacts them, and rather they've focused more on how they can impact their own world. They didn't let their external situation impact their internal drive to live, okay? And I think in that regard, that's something that we should all try to keep in mind, because this life is our own, and we have to fight for this life, regardless of what our situation is, we have to, because that's our only life. This is our only chance, as far as we know, right? And I say this as a Hindu who believes in reincarnation, but this is the only life like this we'll ever get. Regardless if I believe in reincarnation, regardless if I believe this is my only life. The only life I'll ever have that is exactly like this is this life. And if I do not value it, I will lose it. So that's my big tangent on valuing your life, and I think that's definitely something that people have discussed, right? So if we take romanticism as an example, romanticism is not like lovey-dovey stuff. It is a 19th century like counterculture, basically against the Industrial Revolution. And basically, what it discusses is just the impacts of nature, against the man-made, and more about, how we can be reconnected to all of like the elements around us. This is not a new thing. I will take Hinduism as an example because that's what I have the most experience with, but there are religions around the world that discuss this. In Hinduism especially, there is a belief, like especially in very ancient forms of Hinduism, that we rely on the elements. This is not something new. You can see it in many ancient religions. You can see this in like the Mayan civilizations. You can see this everywhere. But the elements were the main building point of our society, because what is human without nature? What is human without earth? Nothing. So in that regard, we have to put ourselves in as a part of nature, right? Even though I said we shouldn't act animalistically, that doesn't mean we shouldn't connect with the nature around us. We shouldn't understand what it means to be a part of nature. Because being a part of nature does not equate to being an animal. You can be enlightened and still understand the beauty of nature. In fact, you can understand it better than an animal because you have that enlightenment. You have that ability to see the world around you. And that is so much more like profound than simply, relying on nature for your food, for your nourishment. Because while that is extremely profound, that is the basis of your life. And I think in that regard, a lot of religions are based on that because, well, you need food to survive, you need shelter to survive, you need all of those things to survive. But regardless of that, romanticism especially, it brings back those ideals from Hinduism and all of these other ancient religions and discusses them as like the individual spirit being the most important thing. Nature has given us a life and it is up to us to respect it. Man-made is not perfect and it is not worthy of our lives. That is more than anything, if there's one message you take away from this video, it should be that. Nothing man-made is perfect and nothing man-made is worth your life. The only thing worth your life is what you choose to make it worth, right? And in that regard, nature is a perfect example because anything made by nature is inherently, how it should be. Humans have had such little time to really evolve and create. Nature has had an entire like lifetime, multiple lifetimes, so many lifetimes of just us to evolve, to create, and to become quote unquote perfect. Nature is the closest thing that we as humans have to perfection. And with that, romanticism basically takes that naturalistic aspects and basically says that if there is anything that we can do to become more perfect, to become more enlightened, to become more free, then it would be through nature. Nature, the thing that's built us up, nature, the thing we were born into, nature, the thing that we rely on for everything. It is nature, not the man made. And because it takes us away from that manufactured entity, which is life, and rather it basically provides us with the whole like perfection of, oh, this is how things are, why is there rain, why is there water, why is there wind, etc., etc., like it's just there to be. And similarly, we as humans are just there to be. We don't need to have any inherent purpose in this life other than the one that we give it, because we are just meant to be here to exist and to find purpose in our own lives. And I think that's just a very important thing to keep in mind. Moving on from that, there's Mary Shelley, and she's written Frankenstein. So if any of you guys are interested in that, you should go read that. And if any of you have read that, you'll know that Mary Shelley basically discusses, technology and how progress is outrunning, human empathy, and how technology can be dangerous if put in the wrong hands. So that's something to think about, especially, in the modern day, especially with the World Cup song and having all of those like AI like songs that are just sounding the same, or especially just like in daily life in general, like with AI, as well as taking their jobs and everything of that nature, right? So it can really just apply to things so far into the future. Along with that, Emerson, he wrote something called Nature. That was his work's title, and it's all about being childlike on the natural plane and just like embracing what it means, to be a human. So it's very profound, and I hope that maybe one of you guys will read something from a romantic writer, because it's so nice to read, especially in contrast to our current and modern day. Furthermore, there's another thing, and it's called existentialism. And existentialism is basically stating that there is no inherent meaning in life but what we give it. So basically, it's what I was talking about before. It's just stating that we as humans deserve to put our own value into life rather than, provide a value that, society has given us. So rather than filling in the blanks and applying it to our own life, rather we choose what we want to have and then have society fill in the blanks instead. And I definitely think that Mersault from the Stranger, as I previously mentioned, he again was hated by society because he refused to follow it. He doesn't cry at his mother's funeral; instead, he falls asleep. He doesn't feel anything when he shoots two Arab people, and he refuses to lie about not killing those said Arab people to save his life, because he doesn't find any meaning in it. He doesn't understand, the rules of society, and he doesn't understand why he has to follow any of those frameworks. To him, it's just like, oh, I have to act this way to please others. He's living to please others rather than living to please himself, which is a very important theme throughout the entire book. I think the book also does a really great job of showing how maybe if there's no meaning put in the action, there's meaning put into it in regards to like physical emotion or physical feeling. So when Mersault is, grieving his mother, he falls asleep. He feels sleepiness, and when he kills those Arabs, he feels like an immense heat on him. So it shows that more of that naturalistic perspective of how nature is very much more it tends to have more meaning than the meaning that we give, the man-made construct that we give it. So it goes back to how humans at the end of the day, we can fall back on those naturalistic concepts again. And then furthermore, despite that, his last line, and this is the last line of The Stranger, he basically states that, oh, I can't even find it. Never mind. He basically says, I had only to wish that there were a large crowd of spectators the day of my execution and that they greet me with cries of hate. So, regardless of that last line where he's basically like, yeah, I hope they greet me with hate, he basically still shows that he wishes to have company in his end. He's not like an alien. He's still human. He's just a human that longs for a life that is of his own making. He's a human that longs for an existence that he can control rather than others. And I think that's a very important distinction when it comes to, existentialism and romanticism. These aren't things that basically say, oh, all meaning sucks and, we should leave it alone. Rather, it's basically saying, no, you deserve as a person to have your own life and to make your own meaning in it. And, these aren't people that don't want any human interaction. Rather, they crave it. Everyone craves human interaction in the sense of everyone craves to find love, everyone craves to have something, right? And if that's the meaning that you base your life off of, then so be it. So it once again shows that more naturalistic aspect of how, nature tends to control ourselves more than, these morals do at the end of the day. And for good and for bad. So it really helps in making that desire and making that purpose in your life really just come true. And then there's another thing, and it's called Sisyphus, which is like, I think all of you know that, but Camus, he basically does his own take on Sisyphus, and he basically states that, like, there is an eternity, pushing a boulder up this hill for Sisyphus, right? He has to continuously push a boulder up a hill and basically, do this for who knows as long, which is a great connection to capitalism if you really think about it. But the ultimate victory in this situation, Camus says, is to realize that everything is absurd, that none of this really has any truth or value to it. Rather, the only thing that we can do if we were in that situation is to just make pushing the boulder your own purpose, to find your own internal meaning, your own internal value in pushing that boulder up every day, which is a connection to everyday life, with work, with school. Find your own ways to personalize the experience and to make it your own. Because at the end of the day, right, you deserve to have your own life. You deserve to have one of your own making, right? The only sin that you can ever, the worst sin you could ever commit in your life is to waste it. That is the only sin you can ever commit. Because at the end of the day, if you've wasted your life in a way that feels like detrimental to you, right? Like maybe it doesn't feel like detrimental to someone else, but if it feels to you that you've wasted your life, you've committed the biggest sin because this entire existence that you've had on this plane meant nothing. It had no meaning. No meaning that you gave it, no meaning that made sense to you. And in that regard, that is the worst sin you could ever possibly have because that was your whole life. That is the only life you've ever known. And once more, it is such a valuable aspect of like the human experience. So in that regard, it should really be considered when thinking about what you want to be, what you want to do. And even if you're shackled by your external, how can you make your internal a pleasant surprise for you every day and make you like motivated to get up, motivated to, do all of these things. So I definitely think that maybe like having a more Camus perspective on like, Sisyphus is so applicable to our everyday lives. For me, especially for school, right? Maybe I don't agree with the grading system and maybe I don't agree with, how everything goes. So I can make it my own. I can go and learn about my favorite subjects outside of school. I can do my own reading. I have control of my own life, even though maybe externally I still have to go to school, right? And I do want to go to school. I like learning. But in that regard, I can choose how I interpret my learning, how it impacts me, and what messages I can choose to, internalize and what I don't. If someone tells me I'm bad at math, okay, that's their perception of me. But their perception of me does not dictate who I actually am and how I choose to live my life. That is entirely up to me. And in that regard, it's something that I deserve and am entitled to have, just as anyone else in this world is entitled to make a meaning out of their own life. And I think, especially for many people, there's a sense of grief because we have such a short life, and if we waste it in a way that feels irreplaceable, then it just brings so much regret. And actually, in The Stranger once more, because it's such a great book, I think all of you should read it. I had to read it like 3 or 4 times to really understand what the meaning of it was, which is hilarious because it has no true meaning. It's the meaning that you give it. So maybe you'll have to read it a few times, but it's such a wonderful book, and I think everyone should at least read, The Stranger or something by Albert Camus at least once. I especially didn't like the book in the beginning, but after reading it a few times, I definitely did like it. So you guys should all read that book if you are interested. But regardless of that, there's just so much grief and so much regret for living such a short life. And in the book, Albert Camus wrote The Stranger. At the very like end, or not the very end, but in some part of the book, Marsault basically has a reflection of his mother, and his mother basically is someone who, has lived a life and she didn't get to like live one of her own. So he basically reflects and he says, I understand why my mother chose to get a fiance at the very end of her life. It's because at that point in her life, she finally felt she had freedom to live a life that she desired, live a life that, maybe wasn't societally expected of her, but still something that she found value in. And I think that's just such a beautiful like takeaway from that book. It's just you deserve to have your own life, and it's never too late to start again. She was on her deathbed. She was so close to death, and she still chose to live in a way that, was meaningful to her. So it's never too late to take your external and make it something that is valuable to you, because you have one life, and it's never too short for you not to take advantage of all of the beauty that is in it, right? Of course, it is a short life, but it's your only life. So in the same way, it's the longest thing you'll ever know. It's the longest thing you'll ever have. So in that regard, nothing is too short for you not to change, but nothing is too long for you to stay the same. You have to have some adaptation. And there's so much pain that people have in general, just like that so many of us wasted on trying to find meaning. I think there's a lot of people out there, a lot of like spiritual people, a lot of gurus, etc., who are all just like, okay, here's how you find meaning in your life. Here's how you find all of these like things. Like you find it in this text, or you find it in this book, or you do it by going and doing meditation or whatever, right? And that in itself is basically societal expectations. No one can tell you how to find your own life. No one can tell you how, you want to live it. No one can say, oh, just go outside and you'll be great, Of course, that's what I would suggest if you guys, want to find some meaning. But even then, that's not the only way to find meaning. That's not the only way to see your life and choose how it goes, right? So in that regard, it's like you can choose how to find your own life at any point in your life, because it's not over yet. And as long as you're alive, you can choose how you live it. And the journey is the only life you'll live. If you waste it, you're already dead. You've already died, because that's the only thing you'll ever know. And I think that's just such a beautiful thing, as it is sad, because it really does show us how finite and how mortal this life is, but how beautiful it can be, and the wonderful potential of it. And I think by learning about romanticism, which I did learn about in school, so that is something interesting, and existentialism, which I learned from just reading Albert Camus, I definitely think that these books, rather than making me feel like, oh, I don't want to live, rather they've made me feel like, oh my gosh, I have such a potential to live. There's so much in this life that is worth living for. And it's so beautiful, because it's like I can choose my own life. And I think it's a cliche statement, right? For so many people, it's like, oh my god, yeah, I know I can choose my own life. Oh my gosh. But to actually realize it, to actually understand and say, oh my gosh, I can choose my own life. I don't have to live the way that you do. I don't have to live the way that anyone does. I can live my own way. To internalize that, to really understand that, it is such a liberating experience, because it really does show you, oh my gosh, you have so much to live for. You have so much that you can do in this one life. It's never too late. It will never ever be too late to do anything, because you have control of your own life. And by just recognizing that fact, and really just internalizing it, it's so beautiful. So I definitely did enjoy learning about those two things, and I definitely thought that they were, so interesting, not only to really ponder on, but also how applicable they were to the everyday life. I've found myself becoming so irritated with all of these expectations that society puts on you, especially as a young person who's, in the rat race to go to college. This has been so liberating for me to realize that there's no inherent meaning in why we do anything. So in that regard, why not I give it meaning that applies to myself? Why not make this existence more bearable and more meaningful to me, rather than, living by everyone else's standards? And I don't think that's something that people really figure out until they're older. So by finding that out, and being able to share it with other people, and of course I'm not even done. The journey is not even close to being finished. But by figuring that out at the age that I am, and helping my friends also figure that out, it's just wonderful, because there's so much life to live. And even though I'm young, if I figured this out when I was 40 or 50, there'd still be so much life to live. It's not too late for me. So that's just my reflection on how I've dealt with all of these things, but also how beautiful beautiful it is. And with like the last like 15 minutes that we have left, I just wanted to discuss, this one poem which basically combines romanticism and existentialism together. Along with that, I'll also, discuss a few books and, talk about a few of the cool things that are going on, more of as like a media segment. But the Emperor of Ice Cream is like this romantic, but also existentialist poem, and I'll read it out because it's very short, but it has this one line in it, and it is so meaningful. And I'll talk about that for a bit, but I'll let everyone reflect on this poem after the discussion, and I'll only talk about those two lines. But the poem is. Call the roller of big cigars, the muscular one, and bid him whip. In the kitchen cups, concupiscent. You can tell I've only ever read this in my head. Curds. Let the wenches dwaddle in such dress as they are used to wear, and let the boys bring flowers in last month's newspapers. Let B be final of seam. The only emperor is the emperor of ice cream. Take from the dresser of deal, lacking the three glass knobs, that sheet, and on which she embroidered fantails once, and spread it as to cover her face. If her horny feet protrude, they come, to show how cold she is, and dumb. Let the lamp affix its beam, the only emperor is the emperor of ice cream. I apologize for my misreading of that. I've only ever read that in my head, but the line that I wanted to discuss was that one line which basically said, let B be final of seam, the only emperor is the emperor of ice cream. Despite like it basically talks about like the pleasure of eating ice cream, to basically being your emperor. So regardless of everything going on in life, life is short, death is real, and like, your purpose for a living is basically just something as tangible as ice cream, right? Despite it all, let B be final of seem, let everything be. Despite it all, your life can be a simple pleasure as like the pleasure of ice cream. And in that regard, make the pleasure from eating the ice cream, your emperor. Make the pleasure of actually tasting it and understanding, like all of the different like flavors and textures and whatnot, rather than just chasing it fruitlessly. And that's how I interpret it. Just to be, after reading all of these things, I interpret it in that way, but everyone can interpret it in a variously like, different way as well. So, I hope all of you can like find a different interpretation of it, or at least like read it once or twice. It's a very interesting poem, and there's a lot more like it. So if you're interested in like romanticism, from what I discussed, like, there's always Thoreau, and there's so many wonderful authors out there. And existentialism, there's Albert Camus, and then there's Soren, I forget his last name, but he's also there for existentialism as well. And these are all just wonderful things that I think everyone should read at least once or twice. And then currently, I'm actually reading The First Man, which is another book by Albert Camus. So it's another, very interesting book about existentialism as well. And honestly, to wrap everything up, I think the main message of this episode was really to like live on your own regard, and to find purpose in your own life, because regardless if we're Sisyphus, pushing a boulder up infinitely and wasting our quote unquote, lives, lives that have so much meaning, right? Like that, and quote unquote wasting the meaning, we can still put meaning in there. We can still find value in that life, even though it seems so desolate. Even if we're working a 9 to 5, even if we're, feeling like we're at like the edge of death or whatever of that nature, it doesn't really matter what our situation is. It matters how we perceive our situation and how we as people decide we want to live. Because at the end of the day, that's the beauty of life. And that's something that I've been talking about the whole time, but it's really true. We can't let the world tell us how to live. We can only live the way that we live. And by doing that, not only do we free ourselves from like the shackles of society, but we also free ourselves from the shackles of our own mind. Because now we aren't judging ourselves as harshly. Now we aren't really looking at ourselves and seeing that maybe we've made mistakes or having regrets. Rather, we're taking our life how it is and saying, that's just my life. That's how I live. And that helps us not only be more mindful people, but it also really helps us become more empathetic and more, like, practice more gratitude. And I think that's something that in this world we all really need to practice and, keep in mind. So I'll leave you all with that, and I'm so happy that all of you, tuned in. And I know this was not something that I usually talk about, and I definitely talked for a longer period of time. But regardless of it, I hope you all really think about, the meaning of your own life and how you want to perceive it. But with all of that said, I hope you guys all enjoy the World Cup. If you are watching it on TV or somehow going to the stadiums, if you're interested in that. And if not, I hope all of you are having a wonderful summer, and I appreciate you tuning in. Thank you for watching Through Their Eyes, and I'll see you next episode.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by StreamingGear.com and DeltaForce.net.